All right.
Start video.
Hello.
It's Luke
Morning.
Griffin,
I'm out of jail.
out on parole. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
Yeah. How do I change this name? Anybody know?
Yes. Go to the three dots. Go to the three dots at the top. And
I'm
on your right
looking.
corner.
It just
Interesting.
I got it,
changed.
Liv. I got it, Liv. You're done.
Oh,
Okay. I don't see 3 dots on this computer, so okay.
well, you get Jennifer. She'll just take care of everything.
Jennifer gives free computer.
Jennifer's amazing.
Manages our environment here. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah. Okay, so where we left off a couple of weeks ago, we were, dealing with changes in the Siddur and the tension between what we believe in and how we express what we believe in the Siddur. How willing are we to make changes in the Siddur because maybe the Siddur doesn't represent what we actually believe, or do we keep the Siddur as it is but reinterpret the words of the Siddur? And we've seen several examples of how that worked. The last one that we looked at 2 weeks ago was the mention of sacrifices in the Musaf service. Right? So, we saw that the conservative Siddur actually made a couple of changes in order to make the prayer for the sacrifices not a prayer for future restoration, but an acknowledgement of the role that it played in our history. All right? And as with every proposed change in the Siddur, some people like it, some people don't. Right? But I want you to understand what's going on with that process. The next piece that we're going to look at is a separate issue, maybe not as volatile an issue, but significant, right? So we see here that this is the blessing before the Shema, right? And this text, this version from the previous edition of Siddur Sim Shalom, edited in 1985, it really reflects the traditional text, right? And what does it say? It says, well, if I'm going to highlight it, I have to go from right to left, but it doesn't really want to do that. V'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot haaretz, bring us from the 4 corners of the earth. V'tolichenu kamamiyut li'artzenu, bring us back upright to our land. Okay. That's the traditional text. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the Israeli conservative Siddur. All right. What does that do? Let's look at this segment. Right? It doesn't say V'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot, bring us from the 4 corners of the earth. It says, bring to us blessing and peace, me'arba kanfot haaretz. You can't see a translation here. This is an Israeli Siddur. it doesn't have English in it. Amazing, you know, a Siddur without English in it, right? But it's for Israelis. So hopefully they don't need it, right? So here are the two key things, right? The first one is the first line in this, right? It doesn't say bring us back to our land. It says bring us blessing and peace from the four corners of the earth. And then the next phrase, this piece here, v'tolichenu kamamiyut, in the original text, it's tolichenu kamamiyut li artzenu, to our land. It says, v'tolichenu kamamiyut be'artzenu, in our land. Okay? So this reflects the reality that Israelis have, which is, you know, we're here. We don't have to be brought here. Okay? Everyone see the difference? Okay, yes, Daniel.
I didn't think I could unmute myself, sorry.
There you go.
So just to be clear, this is a Siddur that's used by conservative Jews in Israel.
Yes.
And we have Sim Shalom that we use with English in the US. Is the English that we're reading aligned with the Israeli one in what it actually says, or are we just translating it differently?
The translation in the Sim Shalom reflects the actual text, right? So
which is different than what we're currently.
Yes.
Full text in Sim Shalom is different than.
I mean, our Sim Shalom is basically the same as the 1985 Siddur. Bring us safely from the ends of the earth, lead us to our holy land.
So the Israelis have gone an extra step and actually changed the Hebrew.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to divert there.
Yeah, no, because that's the key point. All right. So in the Israeli Siddur, it's more about things being managed properly in our land. Okay. Hold on a second. I have to restore this. Okay. So this piece, it's when it says v'tolichenu kamamiyut bi'artzenu, even though it's only a change of one letter from le'artzenu to be'artzenu, it's really more about the proper exercise of power in Israel. Okay? That's the key change. And by the way, the rest of this paragraph, even though it remains the same, it's the same as the traditional text. You'll remember that we talked about the issue of particularism versus universalism. Right? So this piece, if you look in the translation here, says, "You have called us from all peoples and tongues, constantly drawing us nearer to you." Right? In other words, that there's some sense of a special mission for the Jewish people that God wants us to fulfill. Okay? That is retained in the Israeli Siddur. Yes, Gordon.
Why do we have a prayer asking God to deliver us to Israel when we have no intention of going?
Daniel is cheering you on there.
I see it. Thank you.
Well, I would argue that there is a future for the Jewish people in Israel. Whether there is a future for American Judaism, let's say 100 years from now, that remains to be seen. Right? Assimilation, intermarriage, etc., being what they are. Right? And we know that the numbers of Jews are growing in Israel, just as they are shrinking in this country, right? So you may interpret this prayer to be saying, bring us as a people to Israel, where we will hopefully continue to thrive, and not necessarily as a prayer, God, take me to Israel. Right? I have to acknowledge the numbers game. I also don't intend to live in Israel, although, as I have told people in the past, I think it's a good idea for every Jew to have an up-to-date passport, right? Because you never know, right? How much anti-Semitism have we seen in the last few years? More than in the few years before that? It's not declining. It's not shrinking. It's growing, right? So, I may not go, but if that's the direction that it takes for Judaism to survive, then yes, I want it to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, does that help answer your dilemma, Gordon?
Not really, but I understand where you're coming from.
Okay, you still have a dilemma.
Yes.
Well, that's the dilemma that we have in reinterpreting certain prayers. Right? If that reinterpretation doesn't work for you, maybe you want to take your prayer book and your red pen and make a few little modifications there. I give you permission to do that, Gordon. All right, Lou.
It's a little bit of a stretch versus the words on the translation, but it could be people who want to might want to say that it's an increased spiritual connection to Israel.
Okay. And again, if that reinterpretation works for you, that's great. Ronnie.
Okay. If you were to look at an Orthodox Siddur in Israel, do they make changes or no?
Not in this segment. Okay. Maybe in some others. There are prayers that have been added in traditional synagogues and, in fact, in non-traditional synagogues. Right? So, before the state of Israel came into being, there was not a prayer for the state of Israel. Mm-hmm. So the rabbinate, the official Orthodox rabbinate prepared a prayer, and by and large, that's the prayer that we also contain in our prayer book. Okay? Yes, Lou.
The last time I was in Israel, about 4 years ago, I spent a few days with a cousin who lives on a moshav, and it happened to be over Shabbos, and we went to the synagogue on the moshav. I have no idea what prayer book they were using. This is a bit of a religious community, but there were a lot of differences that I noticed. I can't explain them because I don't speak or understand Hebrew, but one of them I remember was in the Amida in Modi section. Mm-hmm. But there were a lot of differences in the prayer book, a lot of extra stuff and some different, and also in the Kaddish, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So that last comment clarifies for me the probable answer to your question. I can't say for sure, but I think they probably use Nusach Sfard as opposed to Nusach Ashkenaz. Okay. So we generally follow Ashkenazi practice in, traditional synagogues in this country because most American Jews are Ashkenazim. Right? There are exceptions, and there are Sephardi congregations. There's a congregation in Memphis that is largely made up of Ashkenazi Jews, but they follow Sephardi practice. They use a Siddur that follows Sephardi practice, even though they're not mostly Sephardim. Right? It helps that the name of the congregation includes the words Anshe Sfard. Okay, Sephardi people, right? They're not, but still. So in the, there are modifications in many of the blessings, mostly minor, right? But they are, they are a little bit different. And so, it doesn't throw you too far off most of the time. You probably were able to follow most of it. Yes, Lou? Yeah, but
yes.
Yeah, but it was not a conservative synagogue, and it was not a conservative Siddur. It was just, they just follow, slightly different practices. It's like, 1 or 2% difference, okay? You mentioned the Kaddish, right? So the Sephardi Kaddish includes a phrase that you never see, almost never see in Ashkenazi congregations. That's the phrase, V'yatzmach purkaneh v'karev meshicheh. That let the deliverance flourish and the Messiah, come near, right? May the Messiah approach. May the time of the Messiah be soon, right? Sephardi lands, Jews, often suffered very intense persecution. I mean, going back to the Inquisition and before in the Iberian Peninsula. And so the desire for messianic redemption was very, very intense in Sephardi lands. So that little sentence added in the Kaddish reflects that greater intensity in messianic issues. And there's nothing wrong about that. It's just different customs are followed by Ashkenazim and Sephardim, right? And we've actually had people come up to the bima in the chapel over the years, like people from other communities, people who themselves were Sephardim, and they'll include that in the Kaddish. And those of us who sort of know what they're doing will say Amen, because that's what you do. When somebody says V'yatzmach b'kaneh v'karev mishicheh, everybody says Amen. Clarified? Okay, good. Yes, Daniel.
I don't want to get ahead of you, but I think this is along the theme of today's class. It used to be that changes happened within ethnic communities, Yemenites, Mizrahi, Ashkenaz, Sephard, etc. But what's happening more recently in the 20th and 21st century is that those tribal identifications start going across, they're more horizontal. And we don't have, it doesn't seem to me, like a agreed upon way to make those changes. As a matter of fact, the changes get made and then you pick the one that you like, regardless of your ethnicity or religious leanings. It's a completely different paradigm than it was for the previous 3,000 years or 2,000 years or whatever.
Yeah, well, the paradigm of the conservative movement is a little bit different, right? It used to be that a rabbi made his declaration for the community, and his siddur was basically their siddur, right? And, you know, even when printing came along, basically there was an agreed upon text, right? Changes were very insignificant and fairly rare, right? Sometimes new prayers got added depending on the community. In the conservative movement, we have a law committee and we have a siddur committee, right? And they work side by side. The law committee will chime in when they think is necessary on changes that are proposed by the siddur committee. Okay? By and large, the siddur committee, you know, they usually, rather than making an out and out change, with the exception of things like, you know, what we just saw in our last session with the business about the sacrifices and the prayer for the restoration of the sacrifices, usually they will offer a different option, right? So in our Musaf service, in the new Siddur, there are different options, right? There's a more traditional option, basically reflecting the change that was made in the 1945 Siddur. And there's an option that basically dispenses with prayer about even mention of animal sacrifices. Okay? So you know, different congregations, depending on their ritual committee and their rabbinic guidance, they can go whichever way they prefer.
But if you were to go back in time to any shul in the Pale of Settlement in Ashkenazi world, and you would walk into a service, you would see very close to exactly the same order of service and content. If you went to the Sephardim, you would see pretty much exactly the same order of service, regardless of what the rabbi was.
Yeah, the order of service would be the same.
Well, the content too.
But and the content's minimally different. I mean, it's less than 1% of the Siddur that is different between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. Now, there is a third variant, which is the Lurianic Siddur. Highly mystical, very intricate, much more like the Sephardi Siddur than the Ashkenazi Siddur, which is interesting because Luria lived among the Ashkenazim most of his life, but he himself was an Ashkenazi. In fact, that's his actual name is Isaac Luria Ashkenazi. Okay? But nobody calls him that anymore. And the Siddur is just Nusach Luria. So you will find congregations almost exclusively in Israel, I'm pretty sure, that use the Lurianic variation or some variant thereof. Okay? It just, you know, it depends. Last time I was in Israel, I had to say Kaddish and walked into the nearest synagogue. There wasn't a conservative synagogue in that town. Walked into the nearest synagogue and it had all these mystical variations, which if I hadn't studied some of them, I wouldn't have known what the heck they were. You know, if you have a doctorate in Jewish mysticism, it helps to navigate some of that territory. Otherwise, it's pretty bloody confusing. And even with a degree, it's sometimes pretty confusing. Other questions or comments before we go on? Yes, Jerry.
Okay. My father came from Poland. He was from Pietrków. That was the big printing city in Poland. And I've got one of his Sidurim, and it says Nusach Sefarad. He was in Poland.
Yes.
Right? So that where did they get this Nusach Sefarad being Ashkenazi in Poland?
That's a good question, and I can only speculate about that because this really isn't my field. You know, how did certain things get transposed? Many of the Hasidic congregations adopted Nusach Sfard. It was more mystically oriented than the Ashkenazi version of the Siddur. And so that's probably where it came in.
My mother was from the Ger Hasidim, so they for sure did that.
Yeah, I'm positive that the Ger Hasidim have always used Nusach Sfard.
Okay, second part of this. Young Israel is getting all these people who are coming from all over, and they went to the rabbi and they said, we want to have a separate service, Nusach Sfard. There's a big fight over that. And they were trying to work it out, but it never happened. So now they've got another synagogue in somebody's house where they're doing all the Nusach Sfard. And these are not Sephardim because they don't go to Beth Rambam. These are New Yorkers mainly.
Uh-huh.
How's that work?
I don't know. I don't get around very much to other cities.
No, I know. I'm just asking. That's, normally you go to a shul, and most of the minhags that you have, sometimes you have to let go because we don't have that minhag at the shul, right?
Generally speaking, that's correct.
But here they're saying, we want you to have ours, not yours.
Yeah. I don't know how that came about there, and I don't know what the status is of that.
Yeah, it just seems kind of strange if we're trying to be friendly to all our other Jews, and we have fights like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, people want the Siddur or the practice that they want. I think that you're familiar with that problem within our own Greenfield Chapel.
Yeah.
Okay? Irrespective of logic, irrespective of whether a person is Ashkenazi or Sephardi, they may be inclined to something else. Yeah, Daniel.
There is a difference. The Israelis are changing their Siddur because they live in Israel and the language doesn't make any sense being there. There are movements now to, for example, remove Musaf or to shorten the service, primarily because people just get bored after an hour. So there is an entirely different reason or drivers for making these changes going on now, and it seems to me like that's a modern thing. I don't know if that's not a question. It's a comment with an implied question. What do you think of that? What is making us change that is legitimate versus, I think, legitimate versus, well, I just don't like it this way, so we're going to change it.
I think that people often prefer the Sephardi Nusach because they perceive it, rightly or wrongly, they perceive it as having more energy to it, more passion. Some people think that the Ashkenazi synagogue in general is a little bit dry. and that the Nusach is reflective of that. I think it's more complicated than that in reality, but that's what I attribute the drive to. That when people are, looking for use of the Sephardi Nusach or want a Sephardi synagogue, that they're looking for something that has a little more intensity. And that's what they want. I think all of our synagogues could use a little more intensity. The past century, the conservative Judaism started out, trying to put a little decorum into the sanctuary, because, the Orthodox synagogue of, the late 19th, early 20th century tended to be fairly chaotic, right? So naturally, we overdid it in the other direction. We wanted our synagogue to be just as decorous as, the church. So now there's a swing back away from decorum. Where do you find a healthy medium? Well, the answer is you'll never find it exactly. But that's what I think, is the reason for the drive to, change certain things.
Thank you. I'll whine about this topic later.
Okay.
I think that's one reason why we have 3 different minyanim on Shabbos morning.
Well, I'm not sure that that's so much about the difference in the Sidur as it is the desire for different practice. We all know why the Museum Minyan was created as a break off from the chapel. That made perfect sense. We also know why the chapel came into existence, because, the traditional Jews of the 40s, 50s, and 60s did not want to go along with the kind of changes that took place in the sanctuary service.
But if we're missing a spiritual feeling from services, which I think is what really is happening, if we don't get enthused by God or whatever, then maybe we need to learn how to do that rather than cutting the service down to the Reform hymnal.
I wouldn't argue with that. And I certainly wouldn't support going over to the Reform hymnal.
I was speaking hyperbolically, without hyperbole.
Yeah, well, fine. I'm not generally an advocate of cutting prayers or cutting sections of the service out of the Siddur or out of what we actually do in the sanctuary. I think that's a dilemma that every congregation has to confront in one way or another. Yes, Lou.
Could I ask you your opinion on the Hechek Kedusha?
You could. Let me take that offline though.
All right.
Okay. All right. Let's go to the next.
Well done, Rabbi. Well done.
I really want to learn a little more today. So here's the next piece, which has to do with also the issue of chosenness. Okay? So the blessing in the middle of the Shabbat morning service, which begins with the words Yismach Moshe, the Matnat Chelko. Right? Moses rejoiced in his portion. Okay? So I'm guessing that most of you are at least somewhat familiar with this blessing, if from time to time you make it to synagogue on Shabbat morning in time for the Shachrit Amidah. Right? So if you do, then this is the blessing in the middle part of the Amidah. But look at the next piece of this. Okay? So the traditional text, it says, "V'lo natato Hashem Elokeinu l'goyei haratzot," but Adonai our God, you have not given it to the nations of the world, nor have you bestowed it on idol worshipers, nor do the uncircumcised find rest on this day, on Shabbat, right? But you have given Shabbat to the people of Israel. Now, notice what they did in the new Siddur. Right? They took these lines that say, no, God, you didn't give Shabbat to the non-Jews, which, if you subscribe to the notion that God indeed gave Shabbat to the Jewish people, I think, it is a distinctively Jewish practice. The Christian Sabbath is significantly different. Though it serves some of the same purposes, it is significantly different from Shabbat as we understand it traditionally, right? But in this Siddur, what they did is they made it optional. Some omit. And not only that, they put it in a smaller font, right? So these are in relatively tiny letters. This is larger, right?
I have read.
This is a piece of what I regard among the Siddur committee as creeping universalism, right? That there's, a trend gradually toward universalism and away from particularism. My problem with that is that, if you continue to extend that and you eliminate or stringently limit Jewish particularism, then the question is, what is there that is special about being Jewish? And how do you express that in the Siddur? So that's a tension, again, that we have to work with. Now, let's just take a quick look at, the piece from Isaiah on which this little piece is based, right? Which essentially says that Shabbat is a Jewish thing, right? But it also says that those who want to share in some of the blessings of Shabbat are entitled to do that, right? So you say, happy is the man who does this, the man who holds fast to it, who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and stays his hand from doing any evil. Let not the foreigner say who has attached himself to the Lord will keep me apart from his people, etc., etc. Right? We'll leave out the part about the eunuchs for the time being. Right? As for the foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord, to minister to him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and who hold fast to my covenant, I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer, etc. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So, in other words, there is a universal element to Shabbat. Okay? So this is part of the rationale for the suggested change in the Siddur of making that little piece optional. Right? Comments or questions here? Yes, Carolyn.
Well, by now, most of you probably know where I stand on it. Certainly you do, Danny. I've chosen not to use the language of that section for a long prior to this Siddur. And I don't think that taking that little bit out, which makes me uncomfortable by its proclamations, affects my identity or the Siddur's identity as a Jewish text.
Mm-hmm. So, in effect, this prayer normalizes the text as you want it to be, as you think it should be.
And I've always had the option to do that. The other thing I would point out that is, whereas Shabbat is not, I think that the way most of the world practices their Sabbath at this time is not so different from the way most Jews practice their Shabbat at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Or who don't practice it.
Right. But I'm not sure that Shabbat is that different from the Christian or whatever Sabbath in practice, certainly in this country, if it's practiced at all.
Yeah, that's true for some people. I would argue that Judaism traditionally has treated it very differently, but for the average Jew and even for many very seriously observant Jews, the differences are minimal. Yes, Lou.
A couple of generations ago in Philadelphia, when I was a young boy, and Bob Kushner, you may remember this, there was a city law, city statute that on Sundays, because of the Christian Sabbath, the Phillies could not play a baseball game before 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday when they were still playing afternoon baseball games. But that was not my original question. Carolyn alluded to it, but in Christianity, the Sabbath is Sunday. There's not as much rest, I guess, talked about as in Judaism, but on Islam looks at Friday as more of a holy day, but is there a rest function that goes along with that? Do you know? Is Friday a day of rest for Islamists?
It is, but again, they will define it a little bit differently from both the Christians and the Jews. So, and that's not really my field, so I can't give a full answer to that. But I think that it's different. I can't give you a detailed
Muslims are more like.
I'm sorry, Daniel?
Most Muslims are more likely to go to their shul on Friday, and that's where their rabbi, their imam, does his commentary and devar always on Friday. So they have some differences with how they observe, but I think that they go shopping and whatever. That's my opinion, Lou. You may find differently in your research.
Well, it may be, but the Jewish tradition didn't start with prayer on Shabbos. It started with rest. It was, back to Breshit, Vishamru.
Other comments or questions? Yes, Jerry. You have to unmute yourself, Jerry.
That's true. Okay. In the Art Scroll Center in the Elenu, they put back some passages that the Christians kind of forced them not to use anymore. And it has.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So when you read Art Scroll Elenu, we read that in there.
Uh-huh.
That was a rabbinical decree they kind of did.
Yeah, well, and by the way, widely accepted by many Orthodox Jews over the centuries. Right?
Mhm.
You know, it was edited out of the prayer book, but many people, you know, just accepted that that was okay. So let me fill everybody in on the line that you are referring to.
Okay.
Right? So right before we say Va'anachnu Korim, in the traditional text of the Aleinu, there was another line which actually was a verse from Scripture. And the verse says, I just have to think. Shehem mishtachavim lahevel varik, for they, the non-Jews, or the idolaters, if you wish, they pray to vanity and nothingness. Umit palalim el lo Yeshua, right? And they pray to a God who cannot save. Okay, now that's a verse from Scripture, all right? So it didn't refer to Christianity. There was no Christianity in the time of, you know, Isaiah. I think it came from 2nd Isaiah, right? So, you know, when Christians took offense at this line, they probably could have taken offense at a lot of things in the Jewish Siddur, but basically they censored the Jewish prayer book. You know, observant Jews, if they wanted to say it, they could, and they still can. And so, you know, when Art Scroll restored that into their fixed text of Aleinu, that was fine with some people, and other people just chose to omit it. And that's pretty much the way it stands. I don't see a clamoring for conservative Jews to restore that line to the Siddur. I will tell you personally, I don't find it offensive. I don't see it as referring in any way to Christians. The standard interpretation of idolatry, as we understand it, does not include Christianity or Islam. Right? Because we don't think of Christians and Muslims as idolaters. We think of them as people who also worship the one God, just, you know, with a whole lot of different practices than we have, but they're not idolaters. And I don't think that that says, it doesn't, you know, as I read, it doesn't say that they're idolaters. But other people's mileage varies on that. So to me, if you want to include it, Jerry, you know, that's fine. If not, also fine.
Well, you know, the old time Orthodox Siddur omitted it for a long time.
For a long time, that's correct.
Because I've got Siddurim that I used to pray in, and it's not there.
Yeah, they followed the censored practice because it wasn't a big deal as far as they were concerned.
Well, it was a big deal when, you know, because they had convert Jews who were pulling stuff out of gematria and saying things.
Yeah,
you know that. That's where it all came to, is when the Christians got involved in these arguments with the Jews who were converted Christians.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So I am going to move on at this point and want to begin the next segment, the next unit of our course. You know, I grew up in the 1960s. I was a teenager and went off to college in the 1960s. And, you know, the number one motto for young people in that time was question authority. Right? We have this question in Judaism, which is, when is it legitimate to question authority? Well, and this is also an American question, right? I grew up in Oklahoma, right? And the 1960s were the age of desegregation. It was the time of the sit-ins at lunch counters, right? It was widely regarded as a just cause, but even many people who described it as a just cause were concerned about how, what actions you took to push that forward, right? Yes, we shouldn't have a segregated society, but are we ready for the actions that will change it? Right? And so, who's responsible for making those decisions and dealing with, how you make changes? The next video you're going to see frames the issue for us. And we will be taking a look, we won't get to it all today, but we'll be taking a look at a specific rabbinic text on how we question authority and what sources we draw on and what values we draw on to assert the authority to make certain changes. So with that, Jennifer, if you will, pull up our video.
Holy moments in Jewish tradition are sanctified with a cup of wine. When we gather together to mark holiness, we include a cup of wine to sanctify the moment. Shabbat begins with Kiddush. The end of Shabbat is marked with a cup of wine or grape juice. Every holiday, the wedding. But the text in this unit from Masechet Brachot, Tractate Brachot of the Babylonian Talmud, teaches us that even Birkat HaMazon, the grace we say after meals, needs a cup of wine every time at least 3 people dine together. While the tradition has fallen by the wayside, mostly relegated to moments where there are more than 10 dining together, what this cup symbolizes for us is quite compelling. The moment when people come together is a moment of holiness. It is also a moment when we recognize that the people we interact with all need God's blessing. Passing around a cup that everyone sips sanctifies the connections we are forming with one another and with God, but also asks that God continue to grant us blessing, just as God has granted us food. You might now be asking yourself, why should we study any text about a tradition that might no longer be central to us? What does a cup filled with wine at the end of a meal have to do with me? But the fact is that discussions about ritual actions taking place at the dinner tables of our ancient rabbis offer us significant insights, helping us to make sense of some of the messiness we confront in our lives today. Messiness that is especially problematic as we navigate our relationships with other people. The text in this unit brings us to the meal of 2 rabbis, Rabbi Nachman from Babylonia and Ula from Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, including also Rabbi Nachman's wife, Yalta, and they are dining together. It is a story that brings us face to face with people who in everyday circumstance are trying to negotiate their relationships with the people around the table. They are thinking with the cup of blessing about who gets to hold and sip from the cup. That is, who counts? Who has authority? Who decides who counts? When can authority be legitimately challenged? Who gets to be heard? Who is silenced, even overlooked or ignored? And how does one voice their opinion and make their opinion known? Who refuses to listen and why? And should we feel competition with one another, as these two rabbis you will see feel? And what are the stakes if we do? What do we gain if we don't? In the end, how do we sit together and respect one another? How do we live with each other in the spaces that we call our homes, which include our workplaces, our synagogues, and our schools? In the case of the text in this unit, a woman will be at the center. Through her, the rabbis confront the patriarchy that they themselves construct. Does it always work? And here's the debate. Does the model of male rabbis at the helm, assuming the power to define what it is God wants from us, work for all? What happens when it falters? What happens when your ritual differs from mine? Your opinion differs from mine. Or let's say your experiences and where you are coming from differ from where I'm coming from. Your gender differs from mine. And now let's add to the mix two rabbis, one from the land of Israel and one from Babylonia, modeling the fact that Jewry has two centers, one Eretz Yisrael, Israel, and one the diaspora. In fact, in this source you will see that the rabbis who organized the Talmud and collated its source material both supported the patriarchy with a rabbi at the helm making decisions for all in the figure of Ula, but also challenged the patriarchy in the name of Rav Nachman and his wife Yalta, who asserted themselves over and against Ula. Together, these figures give us an image of an authoritarian patriarchy and its dangers. The rabbis were anxious about what it was they were trying to build, where a rabbi, by virtue of quoting and interpreting a verse from the Torah, would have more authority than anyone else. While we continue to struggle with who has authority and how that authority is cultivated, while we continue to wonder about how authority scares us at times into silence or generates emotions of anger, we can turn to the Talmud, that is to the rabbis, struggling with empowerment and disempowerment, with respect and disrespect, to provoke us into discussing what power models work best, what power models ensure that everyone has a voice and that everyone is heard. Surely the rabbis leave us to debate how we write our interpersonal interchanges, with how to create relationships that make the worlds we inhabit work better, and the people who we interact with every day get along better. I now leave you with the source to unpack, to think with, but also to take the opportunity to put yourself at Rav Nachman's table in the same situation. How would you have reacted? And what would you have done to make sure that the dinner ended not with relationships gone awry, but with everyone feeling respected, included, and connected?
So our time is up for today. If you want to read ahead in the source, the beginning of Unit 5 has the text of the dispute which is being discussed in this video from Dr. Lehman. And you're welcome to take a look at it ahead of next week. Next week, we'll discuss it and unpack it together. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Jennifer. And those of you who are in our mysticism class, we'll start at 11:05.
Thank you, Rabbi. Great class today. Good job.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.